Hello, I'm Roger Perry. I'm a research wildlife biologist with the U.S. Forest Service in Hot Springs, Arkansas, and I'm giving a presentation on the current distribution and relative abundance of eastern spotted skunks. I would like to acknowledge my co-authors on this, Blake Sassy with the Arkansas Game and Fish Commission, Clint Perkins with Texas Tech University, and Nick Sharp with Alabama Department of Wildlife and Freshwater Fisheries. So in the past 30 years, evidence suggests that the abundance of eastern spotted skunks has declined and their distribution has shrunk. But we were wanting to know where they are now and where did they used to occur. So in 1959, Van Gelder published his seminal work on the taxonomic revisions of eastern spotted skunks. He defined a number of subspecies for eastern spotted skunks, including number one, which was the eastern spotted skunk. Number two here is the Florida spotted skunk, and number three is the plain spotted skunk. He also included these areas where the subspecies intermingled and called those areas of integration. I'm not sure what he meant by that, whether they were hybridizing in those areas or that you would just have the two subspecies intermingling in those areas. In 2017, Blake Sassy published a distribution of eastern spotted skunks in the early 20th century. He looked at using museum records and old trapping magazines. He created a distribution for the years 1900 to 1920. And his distribution was significantly smaller than that was presented by Van Gelder in 1959. So our goal was to determine the current, that is from the years 2000 to 2020, the current distribution of eastern spotted skunks for conservation planning. So for our methods, we contacted fur bear biologists and mammalogists from state wildlife agencies across the historic range of eastern spotted skunks for information on skunk sightings. These included data that the states had from trapping studies, game cam studies, fur bear reports, citizens reports, and road kills. We also examined published research conducted on eastern spotted skunks. We checked museum specimens in the past 20 years, and we included iNaturalist reports. If you're not familiar with iNaturalist, it's a website that allows citizens to report sightings of individual animals, and if they have photographs or anything like that, they can include those in the report. So, in particular, it has a large number of eastern spotted skunk sightings, provided an abundance of information. So we used coarse scale location data for our reporting. In this case, we were using counties as our datum. We only included recent records. Those were collected after January 1st, 2000. So our analysis covered the years 2000 to 2020. And we determined the relative abundance of records in each county using four classes: 0 records, 1 record, 2 to 5 records, or greater than 5 records were our four classes. We created 2 distribution maps, one based on all records and one based only on verified records. So verified records were records that included photo evidence. We considered published research as being verified. Fur trapping records, when the furs were presented at fur sales, you're not always 100% sure that when when somebody catches something and they turn in a report that they actually weren't catching a striped skunk or something else. And we also included museum specimens in our verified records. For unverified records, these were reports from the public to state wildlife agencies without additional documentation such as photographs or the state wildlife official seeing the animal. These included things such as phone calls to the agency that said, we have civet cats around my house in Jackson County, or in another particular instance, they received a letter with no return address that says they saw one spotted skunk alive. So, these reports from the public without any verification, and you can't say for sure whether these folks know what they're talking about when it comes to spotted skunks or not. So results. We accumulated 1,174 records from 257 counties. Of these, 901 were verified records from 197 counties. That was 77% of all our records were considered verified. And if you look at this graph, you can see that the vast majority of counties only had a single record, whereas we had 5 counties that had over 25 records in that county. So you look at our county records and our distribution map. We were kind of surprised about how many records there were from across the range. And these tended to be clustered in particular areas. The black counties are the ones that had greater than 5 records, and they tended to be surrounded by lots of counties that had additional records. However, when we just used the verified records, substantially smaller number of records, but generally still the same distribution with some exceptions. In particular, Western Tennessee and Eastern North Carolina had no verified records. So there were 6 hotspots across the range based on the number of county records. 3 for the plain spotted skunk, which included central South Dakota, the Ozark and Ouachita Highlands, and central Texas. For the eastern spotted skunk, hotspots were along the Appalachians and in Alabama. And for the Florida spotted skunk, just the southern half of Florida. So we drew a distribution polygon around our records to primarily to compare with previous distribution maps. Drawing distribution maps is pretty subjective. For example, do you draw a small circle around the isolated counties in South Dakota and call that an isolated population? Or do you draw a polygon around all occurrences? So this is the reason we did not include a distribution polygon in our publication, but simply presented the counties. However, this polygon is helpful for comparisons with previous distribution maps. So if you look at the current distribution compared to that estimated in 1900 to 1920, they're fairly similar with some obvious differences. In particular, eastern Iowa, western Kansas, western Oklahoma, and eastern Colorado, and south Texas. You'll note here that Wyoming was not included in our estimates. Both eastern and western spotted skunks occur in Wyoming, and there was some confusion when we were putting this together as to where those 2 species occurred in the state, so we just didn't include them in this. So when you compare our current distribution polygon with that presented by Van Gelder in 1959, you notice that the current distribution is much smaller than it was then. In particular, Louisiana was considered a state where it occurred throughout where we haven't had any occurrences in the past 30 years. But also, most of the state of Minnesota is, we no longer had any records. Eastern Iowa, western Kansas, and western Oklahoma, and eastern Colorado again. And in Florida, Van Gelder showed that they occurred in North Florida, whereas now only the southern half of Florida did we have any occurrence records. So in conclusion, Eastern Spotted Skunks remain distributed throughout most of their historic range, but their current distribution appears to be more similar to that estimated in 1900 to 1920 than in 1959. Therefore, the distribution may have expanded in the mid-1900s, but contracted in the past 50 years. An extirpation may have occurred in portions of some states. However, they remain fairly abundant in some areas, including the Ozark or Ouachita Highlands, central Texas, Alabama, the Appalachians, and South Florida. And concentrated efforts are needed to determine if skunks exist in these areas where they are currently believed to be extirpated. I'd like to acknowledge all the folks who contributed data to this project, primarily state fur bearer biologists, but also including some state and federal and university researchers who contributed to the data. And thank you.